In today's social climate, we tend to view the world as one divided into two. You're either for or against, blue or red, law abiding or career criminal. And for most, psychedelics are another version of sides. You're either a raving hippie at a desert festival or a ladder climbing sharpshooter. Two sides are the only options. It's this or that. But my next guest is this and that. He pioneers the convergence of psychedelics, personal transformation, and professional success. What began as typical college dorm room experimentation led to transformative mental breakthroughs. Later, he and some friends began an educational platform to help people openly understand the pros and cons of psychedelics. And so his company, Third Wave, was born. He has since been featured in Forbes, Rolling Stone, and others. And today he's going to share his knowledge for both the curious outsider and the enthusiastic devotee as we ask the question, could psychedelics give us the edge in our careers? Ambitious visionary, practical psychonaut, fellow Midwesterner, Paul F. Austin. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Meredith. That was probably the best introduction I've ever heard. So I just want to congratulate you off the bat on that. Fantastic.
Well, thank you very much. That means a lot because you do a lot of interviews, sir. I think we should probably kick things off with some version of like a health and safety disclaimer, just in case people listen to like only 6 minutes of this, like they don't go off and do, 10 grams of psilocybin or something. So do you have one handy that you can just like pull off the top of your head?
The health and safety disclaimer is we've been using psychedelics for thousands of years. They're incredibly safe when done with intention, with a trip sitter or guide. The sort of disclaimer that I would provide is you can always take more, you can't take less. So start low and go slow. Microdosing is the best way. And to remember that these are largely illegal substances still. So to be mindful of how you navigate this terrain, because the most dangerous part about psychedelics are the fact that they are prohibited and illegal. And we'll talk about why that is in the episode today.
I love that. That's perfect. So, don't do it in the parking lot of the Circle K gas station.
Correct.
Safe set and setting. Assuming most of my audience is kind of inexperienced in this area, or maybe only experienced psychedelics in a recreational setting, I'd like to also kind of kick things off with some groundwork questions just quickly. And so my first one is, when it comes to career enhancing potential specifically, which psychedelics are you particularly referring to? Because sometimes even the category of psychedelics is a little confusing. Like people are asking, well, what is a psychedelic exactly? Which ones are good for career enhancing?
So the ones that I tend to talk most about are psilocybin mushrooms and LSD. Psilocybin mushrooms can be found pretty much on every continent except Antarctica. They grow naturally. There's been a lot of clinical research on them. And especially over the last few years, a lot of people have started to microdose with psilocybin mushrooms because it's a great introduction to the psychedelic experience. And psilocybin has been shown to help with neurogenesis, the reactivation of neuronal connections, and has also been shown to support neuroplasticity, which is the capacity for the brain to adapt, to become malleable, to learn new behaviors and patterns and habits. Now, with LSD is more controversial because of its relationship to the 50s and 60s. It's also much more potent, which is typically why I advise if folks are brand new to this, start with something like psilocybin mushrooms because the room for error is much greater than with LSD. LSD's efficacy is measured in micrograms, and there's 1,000 micrograms in 1 milligram and 1,000 milligrams in 1 gram. It's measured in micrograms, and just even 10 micrograms, which is the tiniest amount, will be a microdose. And LSD is a bit more dopaminergic compared to psilocybin. And dopamine is tied to focus, attention, and motivation. So we've noticed that when people start to microdose with LSD, it tends to make them a little bit more productive. It makes them a little bit more creative. It gives them an extra boost of energy or extroversion. The fascinating lesser known story about LSD is that it was intimately tied to the development of Silicon Valley in the 60s and 70s, that a lot of the early clinical research that was done in LSD was done at Stanford, in Palo Alto, And an author named Ken Kesey, who was famous for writing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was part of those experiments, decided to take a job as a janitor in the evenings. And then when he was working as a janitor in Stanford, snuck LSD out of the lab and introduced it to Silicon Valley and Palo Alto and these areas. And so what I often say is LSD, Silicon Valley would not be here without LSD. And so I think it's no coincidence that it's making this comeback in a microdosing form in the modern age, because a lot of folks who are interested in flow and creativity and productivity are tired of Adderall and Ritalin and these other, even antidepressants as well. And they're looking for a more long-term solution. And I think for a lot of folks, psychedelics can be that solution.
That is so interesting. I did not know that about the Silicon Valley connection. You said microdosing is becoming more popular with both LSD and psilocybin. When we talk about career enhancement, at least in the context of our conversation today, is a microdose, and for those who don't know, a dose so low you basically don't feel it, better than a macrodose, which is something where you have to kind of set aside a whole day and have a sober friend make sure you're okay during that time?
I think it depends on the intention. For folks who are brand new to this, I advise to start low and go slow. Working with a high dose of a psychedelic can be like jumping in the deep end of a pool. It can be overwhelming. It can be difficult to navigate initially. It's why when we were young, for those of us who learned to swim, we learned in the shallow end with our swimmies and with maybe a swimming teacher, because water is a very new territory for a 3 or 4-year-old. So psychedelics are similar in that way, that if we start in the shallow end of consciousness and just start to cultivate a relationship with these substances, we'll have a better sense of whether or not we want to increase the dose and what that experience might be like. And microdosing is also, it's not just, I'm going to take what I call a sub-intoxicating dose of a psychedelic once or twice and see what happens. Microdosing is really a protocol. So it's about how can you do this 2 or 3 times a week for anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks, tracking changes in your baseline, your mood, your energy, your sleep, your creativity, your disposition. What are some of those changes in your baseline from day 1 to day 30 or day 1 to day 60? But similar to meditation in that way, when we start a meditation practice, we don't expect to become less reactive and more patient and have a better mood on day 1 of meditating. It takes time. There's a sort of cumulative buildup of the overall benefits of a psychedelic. And so it's less risky. It's an easier entry point into psychedelic work. And I would be remiss not to emphasize that a lot of the deeply transformative work does happen at higher doses. However, that comes with a lot of considerations, because it is so volcanic and catalytic in nature that if you aren't in a safe set and setting, if you don't have a professional guide or coach or practitioner to support you, if you have underlying trauma that might arise during an experience, it can be sometimes a very confronting and difficult experience. If it's not held well, it can sometimes leave people worse off than better off initially. And so that's why I always say start low, go slow. Microdosing for beginners is really the ideal way to start to work into a relationship with psychedelics.
It's so interesting to me that you talk about the protocols and the checking in and the measuring. That seems all very I don't know, checked in. And I guess psychedelics for most of my life seemed like in the drug category of escapism. And so can you kind of tell me, when you're talking to someone who's psychedelically naive, or even just like plant medicine naive, how do you explain the difference between psychedelics for personal development versus psychedelics for escapism?
A lot of it comes down to intention. There is something beautiful about the recreational aspect of psychedelics. There is a reason why dance and raves are so intimately tied to the psychedelic experience, because it does put us into a trance state. The risk with it is that people often are consuming other drugs with it. It could be alcohol, it could be cocaine, it could be other types of drugs that they're mixing with psychedelics. It also can lead to this form of escapism where I just want to get high as often as possible to sort of forget some of the challenges that I'm having to navigate in my current reality. So a lot of it comes back to intention. Is the intention just to escape, to get high, to forget? Or is the intention to go deeper, to face our shadows, to work on ourselves, to heal and transform? And sometimes people have this intention of, oh, yeah, I just want to escape, but then the experience is so intense that it brings them into confrontation with their deepest sense of self. And a lot of times when that happens, people go, I don't know what that was, but that was not what I expected. This can often happen, when people are just like passing around mushrooms at a music festival and they eat a bunch thinking, oh, this will be fun. And then all of a sudden they're like confronting how they were abandoned when they were, 5 years old by a best friend or something like that. And it's just like, whoa, that's not what I signed up for.
Right.
So intention matters, but also there is a way in which psychedelics, even if the intention isn't to do deep work, sometimes that comes online anyway. So just to be aware of that. And I think for me, what I often look at is a sense of reverence and approaching these substances with an understanding that they are sacred. And so the way that we treat something that is sacred is we don't abuse it, we don't misuse it, we don't look to it to help us escape from everyday reality. We're actually engaging in a relationship with this intelligence or this sacred substance to help us deepen our understanding of reality itself. And psychedelics do a really good job of helping us to see the truth as it is rather than the sort of reality as we wish it were.
So well said. It's interesting to me that you mentioned, I don't know, I feel like it was kind of like you were talking about a skill set. And I've heard you say that in other interviews that microdosing is a skill set. And that was surprising to me because so many times, we think of a medicinal remedy as a passive experience. I have a headache, I'm going to take this pill, go to sleep and call the doctor in the morning or whatever. And when you're talking about microdosing, I mean, you're really talking about a level of engagement that is foreign to most people. Why is it a skill? And how do you acquire that skill without, I don't know, messing up?
So just like cooking is a skill, or just like writing or jujitsu is a skill, when you are brand new to jujitsu, the first person you fight is not a black belt, right? You are working in community, you're working on some of the fundamentals. If you fight someone, it'll be someone else who might be a white belt or a purple belt at a lower level because you don't want to be so overwhelmed that you harm yourself. And I think it's similar with psychedelics, that when we start to work with psychedelics, we come to realize that if used skillfully, they can have a massive impact on awareness, on our capacity to regulate our nervous systems, on healing trauma that we've experienced, on clarifying and understanding our purpose. But if not done skillfully, they can lead to destabilization. They can lead to sometimes traumatic or very difficult experiences. And a lot of that comes back to which medicine are you choosing to use? How much of that medicine are you choosing to use? And what's the set and setting for that experience? So, which substance, psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, ketamine, ayahuasca is another commonly talked about psychedelics. How much of that substance, a microdose versus a therapeutic dose or macrodose? And then who do you have supporting you? Is it one on one? Is it in a group? These are the other important considerations. And the reason we talk about psychedelics as a skill is because the first time you do it, you're not going to be able to navigate it as well the 10th or the 15th or the 20th time. A psychedelic experience can be very overwhelming. So you have to learn, how do I regulate my nervous system through breath, right? At times it really forces you to surrender. So many of us are not very good at surrendering. So how do I allow myself to really surrender and allow the emotions to move through and come through rather than keeping them repressed or suppressed under the surface? There may also be ways in which you learn to, at these doses between a microdose and a very high dose, use it creatively. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll take about 50 micrograms of LSD and go for a long hike, and then have a journal that I sort of write down all of my thoughts and perspectives that come out of that afterwards. So based on the intention that you have coming into the experience, healing PTSD, becoming more creative, healing a relationship, or being more intimate within a relationship, the intention then will dictate which medicine I use, how much of that medicine I use, and who I'm doing that medicine with. There could be a range of intentions, and there are certain medicines that are good for certain intentions. So for relationship work, MDMA is really, really helpful for relationship work. For suicidality, ketamine, which is legal, is really effective at interrupting suicidality. For creativity and flow, LSD, because of its impact on dopamine, is really great for creativity and flow. For detox and clearing, cleansing, purging, ayahuasca is a really complex and interesting medicine for that detoxification and purging process as well. So there's a lot there. And it's even why we have a 10-month practitioner training program through the Psychedelic Coaching Institute, because folks who they've maybe had a few experiences, they want to support others part-time or full-time. There's a lot of context and information that you have to be aware of before you're supporting others through this work, because of how intense and potent these experiences are. That skill is really necessary so things don't go off the rails or go off the deep end. Because, as I mentioned before, folks come into this work and they can become highly destabilized. And after the experience, if they don't have the proper support, that means, they might quit their job, they might divorce their partner, they might move abroad, all of which could be good for them, but the intensity in which they go about it after an experience sometimes will lead to massive destabilization. So it's also why we tell folks, don't make any major life decisions for at least 1 month after a psychedelic experience, because you need to allow time for things to settle a bit before you start, you know, changing everything in your life left and right.
Yeah, I've heard that too. It's interesting to me, all of the kind of words that you're hitting. You're talking about healing and journaling and like heart-centered stuff. None of that really enters into my box that career lives in. Instead, it would be substances that support, that more productivity, I guess, or progress or success, the caffeine, alcohol to unwind at the end of the day. I've met a lot of go-getters lately who are vaping nicotine like in the middle of meetings. It's wild. How or why do psychedelics fit into the business growth model?
Great question. So, to provide the context here, I think it's helpful for like a very brief historical lesson about how did nicotine and caffeine and even alcohol like gin and whiskey and some of these other more potent spirits, how did these become so prominent in our everyday lives? Well, it was because of industrialism and the growth of the industrial society over the last 300 to 400 years. That when Europeans came over to the New World, the Americas, that's where tobacco was located. That's where coffee was located. And they brought both of those drugs back into European society and started to weave it in, because they noticed that tobacco allowed for more alertness, more energy. Same with coffee and caffeine. And within an industrial society, a lot of productivity is determined by how much you can get done. And so drugs that help you be more productive support what we call convergent thinking, which is this process of, what you got to do, you just got to go do it. Those are going to be the more highly prized drugs. And then alcohol in the evenings to help you unwind, right? It's like why in the UK, they go to pubs, right? Alcohol in the evenings helps you to unwind from the stress of the day. And then you get up the next day and you do it again. It wasn't until the 1950s, when LSD was invented, that there was a sort of new drug that started to enter the mainstream culture. Before that, we had cocaine a little bit, like Sigmund Freud was a big cocaine fan.
Did not
We
know
had,
that.
oh yeah, we had mescaline, which was from peyote, that was used by the indigenous peoples of the Americas. But it wasn't until LSD that it was really like, oh my gosh, this is a totally different shift in vibe from these industrial drugs of caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol. And as I talked about already, it's no coincidence that LSD helped to make Silicon Valley, that Steve Jobs said this was one of the most important things that he had ever done, that the inventor of the computer mouse and computer interface, Douglas Engelbart, talked about how LSD was so influential for him. LSD opens us up to this process of divergent thinking, this capacity to hold two seemingly disparate ideas and look at the synthesis of how they come together to form a new idea to solve a problem. The reason this is becoming so prominent nowadays is because of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, AI, more and more is going to handle all of the convergent thinking tasks. The machines will be able to do the things that humans had been responsible for the last 300 to 400 years of the industrial period. All of these convergent thinking tasks, AI is going to handle them more and more and more. What humans will need to do is to solve massive problems. We have a mental health crisis, we have a climate crisis, we have a meaning crisis. We are living through a meta crisis, an existential crisis. And the role for us as humans more and more is to go, okay, these are the cards that we've been dealt. How do we solve some of these problems so we can usher in a post-industrial future, what people often call a regenerative future? And it feels like psychedelics are drugs that help to support that creativity and problem solving. Now, what they also help to do is, I strongly believe they help to facilitate empathy. And I forget who had this quote, but it goes something along the lines of, we don't have a resource problem in the modern age. We have an empathy problem in the modern age. And so substances, medicines, drugs like psychedelics that not only help support divergent thinking, but also help to support more empathy, more of an open heart, more vulnerability, especially within a leadership context. That's why they're becoming more and more these drugs or substances of business, of leadership, of flow and creativity, because they align with the future that we have started to create, which is this regenerative future that I believe is rooted in a recognition of interconnectedness and interbeing, that all things are connected, that there is no separation between you and I, or myself and the environment, or even in business terms, the producer and the consumer. And if all things are connected, then the systems that we are building need to be reimagined. And psychedelics, I believe, can help with that.
I feel like we just went into futurist territory. So for most people who are living now before AI takes over these convergent work tasks, wouldn't microdosing psychedelics to increase their work performance and increase divergent thinking, wouldn't that upset the traditional framework of their job at the moment? Because, you know, we entrepreneurs were like, yeah, divergent thinking is what we want. Let's do it. Let's disrupt ourselves. Let's disrupt the industry. But for those that are going into an office with a 9 to 5 and have things like PTO, I mean, wouldn't that kind of make for a negative effect?
I think it depends on the gig, right? That I would say more and more people are working in a startup culture, even if it's in a big corporation, that creativity is becoming more and more valued. I would say it's not necessarily that psychedelics are for everyone, that maybe the context in which we're talking about this, they are more ideal for creatives, for those in leadership positions, for those who are designers, for those who are product engineers, for those who are maybe even developers or coders, that someone who has some aspect of creativity, they may be really valuable for. However, I will say that the early clinical research on LSD also points to just some fundamental physiological benefits. The three core ones being a better mood, more energy, and better sleep. And so I think regardless of someone's job, whether it's super creative or they're an accountant or they're a paralegal or they're still responsible for some of these, okay, I just got to get things done. The truth is, engaging in a microdosing protocol, just by the very fact that it helps you to have a better mood, it helps you to have more energy, it helps you to get better sleep, will be a net positive anyway. I think that's the other consideration here is we think about this distinction, personal and business, but the fundamental fact is there are a lot of people who are on antidepressants, who are on ADHD medication, who are on certain psychiatric medications that want to get off of it because it's impacting their quality of life. And that naturally bleeds over to the work that they're doing and how how effective they are at work or how meaningful they find their work. And so I feel like with microdosing, even if someone is not in a creative role, if it's done with intention and purpose, it can help them to generally live a better life, which will then have a number of downstream ripple effects in terms of the career that they choose to pursue. Because let's be honest, like a lot of people are stuck in jobs that they hate. And so I think a lot of folks are also, once they come into psychedelic work, it's again showing them this truth of, wow, this job is responsible for all of this stress, for all of this toxicity, for these health issues, for the fact that you haven't talked, seen any of your friends in, 6 months. Might be better to reconsider. Is this a job that you really still want to be doing, or do you feel called to maybe transition into a career that's more fulfilling, but potentially doesn't, make you as much money? I think that's also another consideration that a lot of people are going through at this point in time, a reevaluation of what really makes for a meaningful and fulfilling existence. I think the predominant conditioning has been status, achievement, money. And I feel like that's now shifting where people are more about experiences, relationships, doing work that's meaningful, even if it doesn't pay as well. These are also some of the shifts that we're seeing in the overall work life in 2024.
That's really interesting. When people think about approaching microdosing for work performance and kind of setting themselves up for that, you mentioned intention is one of the baseline ways of approaching it. Are there other considerations that people should have when thinking about microdosing? Because I remember reading that if you take an SSRI, psilocybin may not be as effective on you if you're still on that medicine. Am I mistaken?
So this is where the health and safety disclaimer is very relevant.
Yeah.
That if someone is on a conventional psychiatric medication, Prozac, Lexapro, Zoloft, Wellbutrin, benzodiazepines, Ritalin, Adderall, Vyvanse, and they're interested in microdosing, it's critical they do this under the guidance of a trained medical professional, a psychiatrist, a clinical therapist, a nurse practitioner, someone who has the clinical experience to support them in that, because it's often not smart just to go cold turkey on these substances. There needs to
Right.
be a weaning off period. And people find that microdosing and psychedelics can help with that weaning off period. And it has to be done over an extended period of time. So, on that note, I will say this, that ketamine, which is legal, it's been approved by the FDA for depression, a patented version of ketamine called Spravato that was patented by Johnson & Johnson. That ketamine is a really great starting point for those who may be on psychiatric medications who are looking to wean off of it, because ketamine has no contraindications whatsoever with specifically SSRIs. So you can safely work with ketamine even if you are on SSRIs. Psilocybin, as you mentioned, if someone works with psilocybin while they are on SSRIs, or even if they've been off SSRIs for some time, but they've had a history of use, there often is a blunted response to the psilocybin. So if a typical microdose for, let's say, myself or you is 100 milligrams of psilocybin, for someone who is on SSRIs, that could be closer to 250, 300, 400 milligrams for a microdose, 2 to 3 to 4 times as much for a microdose. There's also the very, very rare, I want to emphasize that, very, very rare possibility of serotonin syndrome when taking psilocybin while on an SSRI. Some clinical trials and clinical research says it's perfectly safe and fine, but I have heard anecdotal stories, like a handful, and I've talked to thousands of people, so not many. And that's typically because it's done on a high dose of psilocybin. But again, if folks are coming into this, if they are on conventional psychiatric medications, do this under the guidance of a medical professional. Ideally, start with ketamine. It's legal and accessible and very available. And then if you feel like you want to deepen that experience, potentially look at something like psilocybin down the road. It can be useful and helpful for neurogenesis, because a lot of depression, again, is tied to this, there's a pruning of dendrites and neurons in the brain, and psilocybin really helps to reactivate those. But there needs to be consideration of all of the context before committing to something like that.
I love how you talk about the brain mechanical aspects when talking about psilocybin, because when we talk about psilocybin, we usually call it magic mushrooms. And to most of us, it feels magical, like it's bibbity boppity boo on our brain. And so I love that you kind of weave in these mechanical, physiological responses of our brain that truly have value in all areas of our lives, but have specific and maybe under-recognized applications in our careers.
And the neurobiological specifics of psychedelics are so fascinating for a couple reasons. The development of neuroscience as a expertise or focus is in large part due to psychedelics, that we discovered serotonin and the properties of serotonin through LSD use in the 1950s and 60s. And that discovery of serotonin as a neurotransmitter led to the birth and development of neuroscience. And also, when people see that the brain is something that we can tangibly get behind, like if we see changes to the brain, that's going to go, oh, wow, like something here is happening. And they've done clinical research where they've shown that after one high dose of psilocybin, it changes the physical structure of the brain. Just one high dose of psilocybin changes the physical structure of the brain for good. It creates more connections between both hemispheres. It helps to develop the prefrontal cortex. It helps to reactivate old neuronal connections. And what's happening within that process is it's interrupting our default patterns. So there's a brain network that's called the default mode network, the DMN. And the default mode network is the network that is responsible for helping us to get things done, to do our normal default patterns. However, in things like depression and anxiety, PTSD, and addiction, the default mode network becomes very rigid. It becomes very constricted. And so we feel when we're stuck in these states like we're stuck in a rut. When we take a psychedelic, it interrupts that default mode network. It introduces chaos. It introduces energy. It creates a more entropic brain. And because of that more entropic brain, it opens up new pathways for new behaviors to be established. One of the best metaphors to describe this is the metaphor of a ski hill. That when we go up on a ski hill and it hasn't snowed in a few days, we just have to follow the same tracks that everyone else has been following again and again and again. But when we do a high dose of a psychedelic, it's like a fresh powder day. It's like you wake up, 10 inches has been dumped on the ski hill. You're the first one up there in the morning and you get the freshest tracks that you can imagine down the back hill of the ski hill. And so you can weave new pathways as a result of that. And that's what psychedelics allow for as well. They allow for the creation of new behaviors, which is why that integration phase after a high dose of a psychedelic is so important, because the brain is more malleable, the brain is more plastic, the brain is more capable of changing, and it requires you to commit to those changes. It requires a clear sense and intention and direction of what it is that you want to change in your life so you can live in a more healthier, connected, and present way.
I'm wondering what the perspective would be from an employer, right? Because obviously you have a company, but it's
I'm
literally
a
a
little unique.
psychedelic,
Yeah.
just a smidgen, just
Yeah.
a touch. Yeah. But as you're talking about all of this, I'm like, yeah, this sounds great. Let's do it. But then, I'm shifting back and forth between various perspectives. And I'm thinking about like an employer who's going, wait a minute, I don't want you to recalibrate your definition of performance. I want to be number one. We have to outperform our competitors. So from like a philosophical perspective, I think there's like a conflict there potentially. How do we make those two less in conflict with each other, or do we?
Well, I think there's an acceptance that in startup culture, for companies that are very early, for companies that are really doing a lot of innovative things, that psychedelics can be a beneficial part of that. I do also know companies, not quite like the Apples, Amazons, and Metas of the world, but smaller companies. A really good example is Dr. Bronner's, the soap company. They now offer a benefit to their employees where they can get ketamine therapy. They and their family can get ketamine therapy, and that will be covered by the work. So just like You have a lot of big employers who are now offering IVF, or they're offering these other perks to create a more enticing workplace. There are companies that are starting to offer ketamine assisted psychotherapy as part of it because it's been shown to help with burnout. It's been shown to help develop more resilience. It's been shown to be a great reset. So I think there is a way where this can be consumed by the sort of capitalist engine, because psychedelics do help you to recover, to reset, to be more creative. However, a lot of people who come into psychedelic work and are committed to that path are more and more turned off by more traditional, conventional models of work. And so I sense that's the future anyway, not to get too futurist again, but massive corporations are a result of this industrial phase that we've been in over the last 300 to 400 years. I think the next 100, 200, 300 years of work will see a massive shift in the sort of structures that we find ourselves in from a workplace, where it's going to be less about the corporation and more about the autonomy and choice of the individual as a creator. And I think psychedelics will help to catalyze the necessary courage for people to leave a cushy corporate, unfulfilling job and pursue something that is more meaningful and aligned with what it is that they really want to be doing in the world around them.
And that will be an interesting industry disruptor, meaning industry as a whole, all work in general, because if people are in mass exiting or, just moving in the direction of things that are more fulfilling and treat them more as a whole person, then as you said, more companies would be financially inclined, incentivized to offer benefits like ketamine therapy or a 4-day work week that supports that and attracts those people to them. And then that positive cycle could continue with lower rates of burnout. This will be an interesting experiment to see where we're at, like you said, in the next 100 years.
Well, and keep in mind, we are potentially on the cusp of AGI coming
Yeah.
online in the next 2 or 3 years, right? We've seen even, one really clear example is with Tesla and robo-taxis. And, I own a Tesla. It can now drive itself. Pretty soon that will be available for trucks. How many jobs are going to be quote unquote lost as a result of AGI in the next 5 years, replaced by AGI? So then the question is, okay, if it's no longer necessary to work to have the same level of productivity or economic development because of AGI, what are those people doing with their time, energy, and effort? And the model that I love is what FDR did in the Great Depression. We had the biggest depression and unemployment of the history of America. And FDR decides that, he's going to make it possible for these folks to go into national parks, to plant new trees, to, help make the environment more of a central part of modern American life. And I think we'll have a very similar shift pretty soon when we see things like AGI, when we see potentially things like a universal basic income, when people no longer have to work to take care of their basic physiological needs. What do they choose to spend their time, energy, and effort on? And I think psychedelics, these are meaning-making substances. As more people work with psychedelics in an intentional way, they're going to align more and more with what is the deepest meaning or vocation that they can provide to the world. And more times than not, the deepest meaning comes from being in service. So again, that shift from I want to serve me, my I, ego, status, achievement, to I want to serve the we. I want to be in service of something greater, because I know that that's true reciprocity, that creates fulfillment, that leaves a better earth and place for those who come after me. My sense is more and more that's going to happen, because in a way, I don't think it cannot happen. That's sort of what the greater intelligence or divine wisdom is calling for.
It's very fascinating how the application of psychedelics for career improvement can't, this is not correct English, but it can't not include these bigger questions, because when we think about our career at the very baseline, at the bottom of the bucket, we think about how can I pay my bills? But I mean, when we take it up a notch into this realm of fulfillment and wholeness and wellness and, how are you like on Saturday and Sunday, not just Monday through Friday, then it causes you to elevate the quality of questions that you're asking yourself instead of how do I plan to pay my bills? It's more of like who I want to be as a person. What do I want to contribute to society? And that really is an interesting and hopeful future. I want you to wrap us up with like practical next steps, because I know you have a really cool microdosing introductory course basically coming up that will answer some of the how-tos for people. And I signed up for the course, and it's already, I've gotten a couple of emails that are like, where do you find these substances? Because that's always the question I get in DMs. Like, love that episode, Meredith, but what do I do? So you've kind of handled all that in a very professional way. You're using technology in a really interesting way to help us, again, kind of elevate both at the same time. So tell people where they can find that and what they have to do next to kind of go in that direction.
We have a microdosing experience coming up in the new year. And folks can find that at the link that's provided, or just go to thethirdwave.co and you can find it there. And that microdosing experience, it's a group container. I am providing lessons and insights and coaching as part of that group container over 6 weeks. It's a 6-week group container for microdosing. And so if folks are curious and interested and want to learn more, we let folks know that we will support them in that process of sourcing by providing a few different resources, because although this is illegal in most places, it is legal in Colorado and it is legal in Oregon, which is great, but it's illegal in most places. It's still widely available. So the key is just to make sure that you can source it from a trustworthy spot. And so that's often what we support with. And then if there are other folks listening to this who are a little bit deeper into the work and potentially they want to deepen that practice as a practitioner, coach, therapist, we do have this 10-month training program as well for practitioners, and details for that can also be found on thethirdwave.co. So that's the brief context. I appreciate you making this such a phenomenal interview. I believe when we spoke at the outset, the challenge that I gave you was to ask a bunch of unique questions, and you did a fantastic job of that. So I really appreciate this conversation, Meredith, and being able to talk about psychedelics and microdosing and work and AGI. And it was a really fun show to do with you today.
Well, thank you. That means a ton. And I know my listeners appreciate all of your insights and higher level question asking. They love that. So thank you for that gift.
Thank you, Meredith.